Basin Council's mailing list. And if you are interested in continuing education.
Okay, so if everybody could please mute their mics, if you haven't already, that would be marvelous. So thank you all for joining us this evening for our sixth session of Journey Down the Clackamas. I'm Dave Bugney, a board member of the Clackamas River Basin Council, or CRBC, and a retired civil structural engineer. Our family lives in rural Estacada. Joining me tonight are Gail Shalom, who you just heard, CRBC board chair, and Susie Cloutier, CRBC stewardship manager, who will assist me in the technical aspects of all of this. So before we get into our program, I'll cover a few items. Some of you have heard this before. The Clackamas River Basin Council is celebrating our 25th anniversary. And since our founding in 1996, the CRBC has worked as a non-governmental group of stakeholders to protect and improve the Clackamas River Basin and its tributaries. Our mission is to foster partnerships for clean water and to improve fish and wildlife habitat and the quality of life for all those who live, work, and recreate in the Clackamas River watershed. And on behalf of the council, I'd like to thank our gold sponsor tonight, Clackamas Water Environment Services, or WES. WES produces clean water and protects water quality for more than 190,000 people living and working in Clackamas County. They provide innovative water resource recovery services, stormwater management, and environmental education. WES operates and maintains 5 water resource recovery facilities, 23 pumping stations, and more than 360 miles of pipe. Each year, they treat more than 7 billion gallons of water, in the process converting materials that have long been considered waste into electricity and natural fertilizer. WES also helps reduce pollution in local rivers, streams, and wetlands caused by stormwater runoff, and it educates and assists community members from all walks of life, from developers, property managers, and homeowners to government agencies, local businesses, teachers, and students. It's Water Environment Services' job to ensure that families and neighbors enjoy the benefits of a safe, healthy water for generations to come. We also want to thank our bronze sponsors tonight, Clackamas River Water Providers and the Geological Society of the Oregon Country. Thanks to all of the many other individuals who have also donated to support the conference, and we continue to seek additional donations which are tax deductible. The Clackamas River Basin has been occupied by Native peoples for millennia. It's originally the territory of the Clackamas, Chinook, Molalla, Kalapuya, and other peoples, and is currently recognized as lands of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, and belongs to other Native peoples who may not be federally recognized. We thank those who came before us for their stewardship of these lands and waters, and those who continue to steward them now and in the future. We are gathered for this journey down the Clackamas tonight to learn in-depth information about the basin and its connections to Oregon as a whole, to connect with each other so that we can support our mutual efforts to improve and protect the Clackamas River and its tributaries, and to have some educational fun at the same time. The CRBC is partnering with the Environmental Learning Center at Clackamas Community College. Workshop attendees will receive CCC continuing education units and can also request a signed certificate of completion for each session. If you'd like a certificate of completion, add your contact information to our Journey Down the Clackamas Conferencing Networking Google Sheet and indicate you'd like a certificate in the G column, and we'll forward your contact information to Clackamas Community College. So before we get started, I'd like to share a few ground rules before we introduce our special guest tonight. So first, please keep your microphones on mute unless invited to participate. And you can keep your cameras off too if you like. They'll help us save bandwidth for our presenter and greatly reduce the carbon footprint of our meeting. We will have 2 presenters this evening with a brief Q&A after the presentation. Please type your questions in the chat and we will select questions from there. Stay tuned for a few polls and feel free to send direct chats to your friends if you're seeing them in the participants list. We have several poll questions, I think, and we would appreciate responses to. The responses will help us in our outreach to others who share an interest in our basin. So now we'll start our presentation for this evening. Remember to keep your questions in the chat box, keep yourself muted, and we'll answer the questions after our presentation. So our presenter tonight is going to be Mr. Mike Bondi, who joined Oregon State University in 1978, first year I started there as a student, and served as OSU's first extension forestry agent on the North Oregon coast until 1985. At that time, he transferred positions to Clackamas County, where he served the needs of private woodland owners and Christmas tree growers for more than 25 years. Mr. Bondi is best known for establishing the Clackamas Tree School, the largest annual woodland owner education event in the United States. Mike was appointed a regional administrator for the OSU Extension Service in 2011 and had responsibility for managing all university extension programs in the Clackamas region. Mike retired from the OSU Extension Service last year, but continues to work half-time as the director of the North Willamette Research and Extension Center. So without further ado, let's welcome Mike as he presents about agriculture in the Clackamas River Basin. Hit it, Mike.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. And Gail, you are triggering me on the share screen, is that right?
You should be allowed to share your screen right now, yes.
Okay, fabulous. Can everybody see that? Gail, is that on?
I don't see it right now.
No, okay. Well, let's go back and do that again. We'll try one more time.
There we go.
There we go. There's always one more button to hit and move around the screen so I can get at my bar. There we go. Okay, folks, how's that look? Gail, is that on for you now?
Perfect.
Okay, good.
Although it says French Prairie Forum.
Oh, I've given you the wrong program. I'm
I was going to
all
say,
right. Sorry
we
about
saw it during
that.
our practice run.
Yeah, you don't want to see that one. That's another program. That's tomorrow night show. Okay, so let me pull up the one you really should have. There we go.
It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting if everything went according to plan. So
I was trying to get tomorrow night's presentation ready too. Okay, does that look good to you, Gail?
yeah, we got it now, Mike.
Okay, perfect. Well, again, thank you everybody for the opportunity to be here with you tonight. And Dave, in his introduction, shared that I am the director currently of the North Willamette Research and Extension Center. I've been actually director down there for about the last 10, 11 years. And I have been here in the county, as he said, since 1985. And you know, Springwater, Clackamas Basin is really one of my favorite parts of the county, although I will say all of Clackamas County is fabulous. And I've certainly enjoyed my career working here, working with a lot of the farming community and the forest owners. As you can see there, I'm a professor of forestry at Oregon State University, and that's kind of where my professional expertise is. And so I had the unique opportunity in my mind, in my career, to work with the Woodland and the professional forestry community. Agriculture, however, is something I've always been near and dear to my heart. My original degree, bachelor's degree, comes from Iowa State University, which is one of the premier agricultural schools in the world. And always had kind of an affinity to the ag side of this county. And agriculture is a huge part of our economy and support system here in the county, and as well as in the state. And so I'm happy to share tonight a little of my perspective of what I'll call the overview of agriculture farming here in the basin. Really, it's a connection, like said in the introduction, Dave's introduction, to a lot of what's important, not just in the region, but in the state. And so I want to give you a little of the past and what I consider the present and even the future, because the past is always interesting. We learn from the past, hopefully. Present is important to understand the context and maybe what's going on in our world today. But it really, both past and present, should help to inform our future. And our future as it relates to agriculture, that's an important kind of discussion for everybody in the basin in particular, because we do have land use challenges ahead of us. We are going to, well, we'll talk about those, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with just what some of that is about. Now, there we go. Okay, so we're rolling. So context, and I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on this, but you see on the left, the Willamette Valley, which is the most productive agriculture region in the state. And we in the Clackamas Basin are part of that important tributary system that feeds into the Willamette River, of course. And the Clackamas Basin on the right is part of this region of agriculture in the state of Oregon that we do call the Willamette Valley. So we are truly blessed to live in one of the most productive regions for agriculture in the country. And there's many great ones, don't get me wrong, but the Willamette Valley is certainly unique. And it is truly the heart of agriculture and farming here in this part of the state and even the region. And one of the things that is very unique, and you may be aware, is that we grow an incredible variety of different agricultural crops. I think the number is about 227 commercial agricultural crops. That's crops that are grown not for fun, but because people actually sell them, create commerce, create economy, and provide goods and services to citizens. And the other thing that's unique about agriculture in this particular area of what I call the North Willamette Valley, so everything essentially, let's call it north of Salem, Marion County, Polk County, Yamhill County, Washington, Multnomah, Clackamas, and Columbia County, that 7-county area, about half of the state's entire farm gate value that is generated from the sale of all agricultural crops in the entire state, come from farms located within a 50-mile radius of where I work every day in Aurora at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center. And for those that aren't familiar, we're just south of the city of Wilsonville, a mile east of the I-5 freeway if you take the Charbonneau exit, and we have a 160-acre research and education farm there. And it usually surprises people to know that half of the value of agriculture comes from that specific location in the North Valley, which, by the way, includes the Clackamas River Basin. So and I'll just give you some cocktail party trivia. I've always been a big fan of trivia. These are the kinds of things people often will remember. They won't remember necessarily a lot of facts, but let's boil it down for you. We in Oregon are the United States' leading producer of most of your berry crops. That would be blueberries, blackberries, boysenberries, logans, and blackcap raspberries. We also just call them blackcaps. We're the nation's leading producer of hazelnuts. You're probably familiar with that. You hear it all the time. We are the world leading producer, that includes the United States, of grass seed crops like ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, and also lead the nation in orchard, and you see them there listed. We're also a leading producer in this region, in Oregon, of what I'll call vegetable and flower seed. Now I've listed 3 in particular: carrot, onion, and sugar beet seed, that we actually lead the nation in. But we are a major player in providing seed for agriculture. That's people that grow carrots, not for the carrot vegetable, underground, the root vegetable, but for the seed, so that farmers and home gardeners actually have something to plant. Somebody actually has to raise it for the seed. And then you can see some of the other crops: potted florist azaleas, which come from a couple of our major nurseries in the southern part of the county. Christmas trees, and I've highlighted here in orange a couple of these crops that really are produced right here in the basin in a significant way. And then we also, we aren't top producer, but one of the 2nd or 3rd largest state for other crops. And let me highlight their nursery and greenhouse. Right now we're ranked 3rd in the United States in the production of nursery and greenhouse stock. And that is a very, very important industry, of course, here in Clackamas County, as well as in the Clackamas River Basin. Now, what's most unique and might get missed here is that when I talked about 227 commercially grown crops, you should realize there's only one state in the United States that has a greater diversity of commercial crops that are grown, and it would be the state of California. And just for perspective there, the state of California's agricultural economy and their footprint, the number of acres, is 10 times larger than Oregon. So I guess if we kind of looked at that in terms of diversity per acre, we win hands down. And then a final notable fact goes back to the seed production. And this is important to realize too, and this paints the picture of the context of why agriculture is important, not just in the basin, but for all of us in Oregon. And this includes, by the way, our friends that live in the metropolitan area that don't even have a garden. They rely on all of the rest of us that are producers to produce for them. There are only 3 major places in the world that produce the majority of vegetable and flower seed for commercial farmers and gardeners. And we in Oregon are one of those 3 places. So when you really step back and look at it, you say, wow, that's critical, because if somebody's not producing those kind of crops, then obviously the rest of commercial agriculture and home gardening would really suffer. And then finally, not to bore you with statistics, but again, to give you some sense of scope here, agriculture in the state of Oregon is about a $5.5 billion industry. Going back to California, about 60 billion. So, you know, the scale here is unbelievable. But still, in Oregon, everything being relative, Oregon agriculture employs about 15% of the state's entire workforce and contributes about 20% or 1/5 to the state's economy. And of course, as you probably are familiar, many of our products are shipped truly worldwide to support people in many other places. Well, let's kind of go from the golly gee whiz facts and figures stuff in the context to talk a little about the history of farming in the Clackamas River Basin. Obviously, we are in a unique position because of the Oregon Trail and the early settlement of this region of this state. And it was those early pioneers who, of course, were living on the land and surviving off of the land back in the day when this state was, even before it was a state. So in the Great Migration that started in the 1840s and 1850s, you know, since then there's been a rich history of agriculture farming, certainly all around us. And of course, in those days, much of it was subsistence farming, people coming onto the ground. And they were homesteading, they were proving up their ground. They were obviously relying on that land to produce for themselves and their family, maybe their neighbors, whatever. It was work animals. It was a lot of pasture intensive, usually not intensive, pretty low intensity, low technology, of course, at the time. And everything was locally produced for local consumption. And that's the way agriculture really looked through that period of initial migration through the 1880s, 1890s, and even to a large extent into the 20th century. One of the interesting things you may not be aware of is that we have in Clackamas County, and also reflected in the Clackamas River Basin, we have a larger percentage of small farms than any place in the state. In fact, Clackamas County has more farms today in 2021 than any county in the state of Oregon by a factor of 2, almost 2. So in other words, we have about 4,000, a little over 4,000 farms in our county alone. And the next nearest counties would be Lane and Douglas. that are in the 2,600 range. So that's quite a disparity. And then all the other counties in the state are considerably smaller. So I find that kind of interesting. And it's really kind of a dynamic that's unique, obviously, to Clackamas County. A lot of landowners, a lot of smaller parcels. Our median farm in this county is 10 acres. So that means there's as many farms above 10 acres as there are below 10 acres. And that's just an artifact to a large extent of the original settlement and the fact that we are in the Portland metropolitan area near the largest concentration of people, and it facilitated people, you know, migrating back and forth to the urban center, working in the urban center, living out in the country. And of course, we still see that with probably many of the people in our audience tonight. Want that rural kind of lifestyle, want to have a few acres, want to be attached to the land, but don't necessarily earn their livelihood from it. And then the other thing I would share, and certainly as we reflect on agriculture in the Clackamas Basin, as well as other places around the state, agriculture is always changing. You know, I can look back at least now on my career, which spans more than 4 decades, and notice the significant shifts that we've seen in our, not just agriculture, but natural resource land use, policies, and that change is always occurring. And obviously it relates in a large part to technology, learning better ways to do things, practices change, markets change. There's all kinds of reasons, but agriculture is always changing. And so, you know, the crops that were grown years ago, obviously are not the crops that are grown necessarily today, although some are. And it's important to think about just what will be the forces that will affect change in the coming years. And that's what I want to share with you a little now. If I go back, let me go back. The first significant seminal work on agriculture really started in the 1920s with a gentleman in Clackamas County named John Inskeep. If you're familiar at all with Clackamas Community College and the Inskeep Environmental Learning Center, that was named after John J. Inskeep. John was not the first, but he was one of the very early Oregon State University extension agents, an agricultural extension agent in Clackamas County. And I can't help but do a little commercial for my employer, which is Oregon State University. At the time John was hired in this county was 1926. So it was just, you know, shortly before the Depression. It was then known, Oregon State University was then known as Oregon State College. And John had an assignment here to be an agricultural resource in the community. But his impact over the years is just extraordinary. He served in this county from 1926 to 1962, so 36 years, and was a prolific writer. He was taking photographs, crystal clear black and white photographs back in the days when I didn't realize people had cameras even. But he did some amazing work. He convened a conference in 1936 called the Clackamas County Agricultural Outlook Conference, which really talked about the issues of the day facing agriculture and how we needed to really come together in this community in order to support all the people that need, rely on food, which is all of us, and how to meet those needs in the farming community. Part of that report included some really fun kind of statistics. He loved numbers, John did. And he was looking at the previous decade. Remember, this report was written in 1936. So he's going back 10 years and said, okay, this is what agriculture looks like in Clackamas County. About at that time, just for reference, about 35% of all farm income was poultry. Back in the day, we were the mecca for poultry production, chickens, turkeys primarily, huge industry throughout the state. And we still are a very large producer of poultry in the state. But in those days, of course, it was everywhere. Everybody had a chicken house or a turkey house, and a very common land use for agriculture. The other big one at the time was small fruits, berries. And this part of the country, Oregon, Western Oregon in particular, Willamette Valley in general, really was an ideal climate for growing berries. Not too hot in the summer, adequate rain, but it was also dry Mediterranean climate in the summer, so we didn't get summer rain, which would cause disease and infection on the fruit and rotting. And so we quickly, in those early years of agriculture, became a center for berry production, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then, of course, a lot of livestock on our farms back then, again, because a lot of people that were living on the land were also raising their own cattle for their own use, milking their own cows, and then selling as well. So agriculture included a lot of animal husbandry in the days. One of the big contributions that John made to agriculture in Clackamas County, besides what I've already shared about his work, is that he was an agronomist. So in other words, someone that really was trained in agricultural crop production, and did a lot of that early work, working with grain crops and grass crops and clover, introducing different kinds of grass crops and cover crops for farmers at that time. And it was also a time when we were really seeing some significant evolution in farming practices that included technology. Irrigation was just starting to become commonplace, and more and more machinery was coming onto the farm, which allowed farmers to be able to manage more acres and be more efficient in their work. So this is some of the history that would really be lost if it wasn't for people like Inskeep. The other crops that were really important in this region, especially in the Clackamas region, were vegetables, in part because proximity again to Portland and where the demand for food crops were. And that included a lot of potato production, even here in the basin. One of our big potato growers was the Mostel family right down there at Baker's Ferry. I can remember Elmore, who's passed away since, of course, but he was a big time potato farmer before he became a Christmas tree grower. And that's kind of that evolution that I was talking about. Farmers go from one crop to another as they see a new opportunity in the marketplace, or they become interested in trying to grow something else, or maybe they're interested in diversifying their portfolio of what they grow. We mentioned livestock. Besides the cattle and the milk cows, pigs were big. Horses were always big and still remain very important part of our agricultural livestock scene here in Clackamas County. The berry crops, the ones that I mentioned before, raspberries, blackberries, blackcaps, also included strawberries. Oregon truly became the strawberry capital of the United States in those early 1900s. And really, we were the top producing state for strawberries through the 1970s. And it was at that time that the California market took over. People realized that they wanted to have strawberries, fresh strawberries, all year round, instead of just in June. And of course, our strawberries here are June, what we call a June bearing crop. We get all those beautiful, juicy red Oregon strawberries in the month of June, but then we don't have anything the rest of the year that's fresh. And so if you're not putting them up, freezing them, or making pies and jams and jellies and that kind of thing, then you don't get to enjoy them. But in California, they came up with some what we call day neutral varieties, which can flower year round, not just once a year, and produce strawberries year round because of their favorable climate. And it wasn't too long at all until California and their scope of agriculture took over that market and is today. We are in Oregon, we're the third leading producer of strawberries now in the United States, and we produce 1% of the nation's crop, and we're third. California produces 97% of the strawberries in America. Other crops important in the day, in the early part of agriculture, commercial agriculture in the basin, included nut crops, fruit and nut crops. So we had the berry crops, small fruit, but I'm talking about tree fruits and tree nut crops. In particular with nuts, we had a lot of people growing walnuts, hazelnuts, and prunes, plums, prunes, Italian plums or prunes, Italian prunes were widely grown. There were prune dryers around throughout the region of the basin, as well as, of course, other parts of the state. Hazelnuts were never as big here as they became in, say, Yamhill and Polk County and Marion County, even other parts of Clackamas County. But nonetheless, we have the dubious distinction of, I believe, what was the first location of the Eastern filbert blight when it came into Oregon was back in about 1992, I'm going to say, over in the Damascus area. So right there in part of the basin. Hazelnuts, again, as I mentioned earlier, huge agricultural crop for us in Oregon. We produce about 99% of all the hazelnuts commercially in the United States come from Oregon. And then, of course, agriculture would not be complete without a discussion of nursery crops, ornamental nursery crops. Everything from trees, fruit trees, apple trees and pear trees and every other kind of fruit tree, to nut trees, to landscape plants, to bedding plants, all those wonderful vegetable starts that you see in the nurseries right now. They all come from some kind of either greenhouse operation or a field nursery. And Oregon, as I mentioned before, is one of the top three. It's number 3 in the United States in production of nursery and greenhouse crops. In fact, in Oregon, the nursery industry, greenhouse nursery industry, was the first ever $1 billion with a B farm gate value for an agricultural crop in this state. So if you go back and you say, well, okay, agriculture is about, total value of agriculture in this state is about $5.5 billion, and $1 billion of that comes from the nursery industry. That's significant. But if you reflect on that a bit, you go back to the pioneer days, and what happens is that one of the early things along the Oregon Trail were people coming out from the Midwest bringing fruit trees with them. The Llewellyn's of Milwaukee, and if you're a student of any history of Oregon history at all, you probably know that name. He was a nurseryman, came out of Iowa, had other family members that followed him, and they started what is supposed to be the first nursery in Oregon, in the Portland area, in the Milwaukee area. The area right now that is Waverly Country Club used to be their nursery farm. And that was in 1847. So nursery industry goes way back to the very beginning of this state, even before 12 years, before it was a state, before Oregon was a state, and then has evolved since. And today is the dominant part of agriculture, and just gave up its reign as our #1 crop. And we'll talk about that a little later. So that's context for how this basin developed in terms of our agricultural land use. The shifts, now let's look at the shifts. And it all started, really significant shifts started, I would say, in the post-World War II era. I'll just do it kind of by decades. And this is not to suggest that everything happens on a decadal kind of a sequence, but it's just, I'm a kind of a linear guy, and it just makes it easier for me to think about things. The nursery industry really exploded. I mean, again, goes way back to the very beginning. You had a nursery industry in the state literally for 100 years. And then after World War II is when it really exploded and took on new meaning. And that was a result, as you can imagine, of post-World War II, troops returning, housing boom, baby boom. Now, maybe that wasn't the exact order. I'll take liberty to say that. But nonetheless, housing boom with landscaping and need for plant material to landscape these new homes. And that was really where we saw a huge growth in the already a significant nursery industry. Up until World War II, the value of the nursery industry, farm gate value in those days was about $100,000. It just reached $100,000 and then took off wildly after that. There were other important factors, though, that we shouldn't lose sight of, and we can talk more about the nursery industry a little later. But again, the significance is the number of growers and the sheer size of those operations, the people they employ, and the portion of the economy that they support. There were other important things, though, to recognize, and this is going to be another theme going forward, is that how public policy can really influence what happens in agriculture and what we see on the ground. Agriculture, and I might say natural resources. In 1955, the Congress, federal Congress, passed a long-term capital gains treatment of timber and trees. So in other words, when you sold trees, harvested trees, sold logs, you could now claim a long-term capital gain on that income. Prior to that, you couldn't. And so there was a real tax disadvantage to that harvest. That long-term capital gains treatment was done by Congress in order to stimulate the forest industry so that they would produce more product to build more homes. Again, think of the area we're in. And also to spur new industry in general. Part of that long-term capital gains on trees was also translated to any tree crop that was even younger than timber age. And what was going on there was the early stages in the 1950s of people thinking about how to grow Christmas trees. Up until that point, Christmas trees were all harvested in the wild, up in the mountains, and in other parts of the country in the same way. And as these forest owners started to realize that, okay, we can actually manage forest land. There's a tax advantage to managing it sustainably, planting trees after harvest and growing another crop. Now we had some tax advantage to do that. That's great, but there's still a big problem. Who's going to plant anything and wait 40, 50, 60, or 70 years for a harvest? So some of those very early growers started to think about, well, what could we do? Is there an agricultural crop that can be grown with the forest crop in order to provide income during that interim period? And people started planting trees, trees for Christmas purpose, growing them in plantations, and even growing them in combination with timber. So that you could have an intermediate crop. All that was going on during the 50s. It led to then in the 60s, kind of the beginnings of what I would call the plantation Christmas tree business that we know today. So that's 50 years of history. And one of the primary production parts of this region for growing Christmas trees became the spring water area in the Clackamas Basin. In fact, I would say by the 1980s, it was the largest single expanse of Christmas trees, certainly anywhere in the United States, which would make it anywhere in the world. And that stretched, I remember driving those roads when you had Christmas trees, wall to wall Christmas trees for over 5, 6, 7 miles through the spring water ridge. That was the crop everybody grew. And it really kind of peaked in the 1980s. We were fortunate in this area. We had an extension agent. It was a gentleman who was actually hired by John Inskeep, a young lad in 1957 named Clayton Wills, who worked out of the extension office in Clackamas County, which is in Oregon City. And he grew up, he was trained as a poultryman. So he was working here in the county with the turkey growers and the chicken growers. But he quickly realized that one of the real needs was to help these farmers who are trying to figure out how to grow these trees in a plantation and culture them and get them to a market and develop market. So he started working with those folks. And again, we had some great names throughout the Clackamas Basin in those early years. People like Bill Tucker, who really was a timberman, but got into Christmas trees and was growing them, you know, side by side in the same plantation. Elmer Mostel, who I mentioned earlier, who was growing potatoes. Clayton got a hold of him and convinced Elmore that he ought to start planting Christmas trees, and did. And by the time Elmore got out of the business and retired, grew probably some of the finest noble fir you'd ever see. It was just an incredible farmer. That's, again, history of the Clackamas Basin. And I could go on for quite a while naming people, families that really developed this industry. Today, Clackamas County, well, let's go back. Today, Oregon, starting in 1978, became the nation's leading producer of Christmas trees. Clackamas County historically has been the largest producer of Christmas trees of any county in the United States, which makes it biggest in Oregon, of course, too. In fact, today, I would say that 1 out of every 10 or 12 Christmas trees that will be in homes across the United States this holiday season will come from Clackamas County. That's incredible to think about. And there's a tremendous history and legacy to this work that these people did. There were probably in the day, there were 5 major production areas in this county, Springwater being one of those. Another concentration of growers, a very different kind of growers and trees that were growing up in the sandy country. A whole nother group of growers in the Beaver Creek, Oregon City area. Then there was the posse, we called them the posse. They were south of Molalla up in the hills. And then by the 1980s, people had moved down on the valley and said, let's grow Christmas trees like real farmers do down on the valley. You couldn't grow noble fir down there. You couldn't really grow grand fir down there. They weren't suited to those valley floor locations, but you could grow Douglas fir. So that's where that was happening. In the 1970s, it was woodlot management. You might say, well, that's not agriculture. Well, it's not agriculture, but it's related. But more importantly, again, I want to reflect on some of the policy changes, tax law changes that really spurred development. Major tax law changes in the 1970s, 1971 to severance, small tax, optional tax, got us away from ad valorem. There was a property tax reason why you would plant trees and grow trees. A brand new Forest Practices Act in 1971. It was the nation's first comprehensive Forest Practices Act that required people to plant trees after they cut them down. A whole bunch of other, regulations were included in that. Expansion of a service forestry program, assistance program for landowners, creation of the extension forestry program in the 1970s. I mean, those are all factors that led to what we have today, which we consider one of the most progressive states for growing, managing, and caring for forest land, which includes obviously much of the headwaters of the Clackamas Basin. So Clackamas County and the basin became major players in that entire scene. When we got to the 80s, interestingly enough, that was the very first published comprehensive soil survey for this county. That was in 1985. That was the year I came to Clackamas County. I remember it well. It was one of the first workshops I attended, a workshop put on by State of Oregon, Oregon Department of Agriculture, and the Soil Conservation Service at the time, called the Soil Conservation Service, rolling this document out. It was really important because it helped us understand the soils of the county and the appropriate uses for those soils. What came of it, though, that was really unique here in Clackamas County, but happening in other counties too in different ways, was the requirement to really pay attention to soils, suitability of soils, when people were now moving onto the land, trying to get a building permit for building their house on rural land. And of course, this relates to our land use planning zoning laws, which came in with Senate Bill 100 in the 1970s. I failed to mention that earlier. So this was all pretty new stuff. And all of a sudden, crop diversification, working with smaller landowners that now we're going to have 20 acres, and in order to satisfy the requirement to build a house, had to come up with an agricultural management plan. And frequently they would turn to people, well, they would turn to us in the extension office and say, oh no, now what do I do with this piece of ground? And Christmas trees, specialty crop, you know, a crop like that didn't require a lot of equipment, could be done kind of quote part-time, people thought, became really hot. Specialty crops were being grown, ornamental nursery crops. We saw Christmas tree growers now diversifying and growing things other than Christmas trees. Hybrid poplar trees are being planted as an agricultural crop in the 1980s. There was a boom and a bust cycle on that once people realized that there was no market really for that. So you had much more attention to soils, you had much more attention to diversification and trying to figure out ways, creative ways to make money in farming. And of course, there was at that time a growing interest in what I would call environmental concerns and making sure that we're taking care of the land and we're minimizing erosion and you know, starting to look at the pesticides that are being used and how to minimize some of the environmental impacts from those practices. In the 1990s, that's when the locally grown movement really moved into full stride. We had farmers markets and direct sales at farm market stands for a lot of years. You'd see them all over the county. You certainly saw them all over the Clackamas Basin as well, where farmers were direct marketing to consumers. But it was really the farmers markets and CSAs that followed, community supported agriculture, that really started to take off. And it's important to realize that, you know, those markets were around long before the 90s, but it wasn't until the 90s that they became pretty fashionable, we'll say, and much more common in the communities, and creating more and more opportunity for small farmers in particular, but large farmers as well, to diversify their market and create more opportunity for selling their product. And so we saw all kinds of interesting things being done in the 90s. I had growers right here in the Clackamas Basin growing mushrooms, garlic, again, berries, but now the shift in berries was to things like blueberries, which became more and more popular, never was a crop earlier on, and then kiwi fruits. We actually went through a period in the 90s where we had quite a few farmers that thought they could make their next million growing kiwi fruits, until we figured out that wasn't going to work. And then a whole host of vegetables, specialty vegetables, and that's only grown and developed over the years. By the 2000s, it was wine. And of course, wine was hot. Everybody wanted to drink it. And a lot of people thought they wanted to be a vineyard owner or a winery, owner or whatever. Huge amount of capital required to do any of that. But nonetheless, what was interesting is that grapes had always been grown in the basin here, but it was really mostly for personal use, at least historically. And a lot of the wine that was produced, especially up in the Sandy area, a little outside the basin maybe, but was fruit wines. But as that industry developed in the 1970s and 80s in the Willamette Valley, in particular over in Yamhill County, Washington County, other areas, it became obvious that the best soil to grow grapes on was a Jory soil. And guess what? One of our most common soils, if not the most common soil in Clackamas County and a big part of the basin, is a Jory soil. So then people said, well, why aren't we growing those over on the east side? Everything seemed to be on the west side of the valley. And so we started to pick up grape growers, vineyard growers here in Clackamas County, as well as in the basin. And then the most recent wave, and I'm sure you're familiar with this is the cannabis type crops. We'll call it cannabis if it's marijuana, either for medical or personal use. And now more recently, industrial hemp, which is also, a cannabis product, species or genus anyway. So again, importance going back to those legislative changes that enables all this legalization of cannabis for medical use in 1998 and personal use in 2014. And then the federal legalization of industrial hemp as an agricultural crop in 2018. That now has spurned a whole nother industry for our farming community. And we see some of that all over the county. We see quite a bit of it all over the county, in fact, I might say, including in the basin. One of the things that's interesting about Oregon is we have more history growing this crop than any other place. So we have that institutional knowledge, the growers do. Let's be frank and honest about it. Most of it has been as a black market crop, an illegal crop being grown out in forest environments and places that are less than ideal for farming. But nonetheless, people have developed some expertise. The other thing that you may not realize is that Oregon State University was doing hemp research as early as 1880. That would have been for industrial hemp, what we call industrial hemp, and did that work until the 1930s when the federal government made it illegal to grow hemp as an agricultural crop. And then it never came back to be legalized until 2018. Today, cannabis is the largest single agricultural crop in the state and exceeded $1 billion. Remember how I said nursery greenhouse is our largest sector of agriculture and was the first crop to hit $1 billion? Well, guess what? These guys have now surpassed us in 2020. And there's no signs that it will get a lot smaller, especially once some of the federal legalization at the federal level for marijuana comes into play and the banking issues and all that are resolved. So all these shifts are just part of agriculture and how we go. There's our crops today. Notice I don't have cannabis or hemp on there because they don't show up in all the official reports yet because they haven't figured out how to tally all that. So I can't give you that for the county. I can just give you the state statistic. But these are the county breakdowns of what you see today. Nursery greenhouse being the biggest, Christmas trees second, berries third. That's of our plant crops. And then on the livestock side, still far and away the biggest part of agriculture for livestock in Clackamas County is 47 million. I wish I could give you Clackamas Basin data, but that does not exist. So that's the past, that's the present. And so now the question obviously becomes, where does this go in the future? There's huge issues facing everyone, whether it's agriculture, any industry, homeowners, whatever it is, we all have our challenges, right? Agriculture, I would sum it up this way, that labor will continue to be a huge problem. It is now. Much of what we do in agriculture traditionally has been very labor intensive, takes a lot of people. And for us, 95% of the people in Oregon agriculture that do the work on the ground day to day have been the migrant community, migrant workers. And as those regs have changed, people have been trying to solve the immigration crisis for many years with no apparent success. It will continue to be an issue. One of our challenges in Oregon agriculture right now is that labor source that we've traditionally relied on. Not only is it more difficult to get your workers, but the workers we have that have been here for 20 and 30 years and sometimes longer are aging out, and there are no young people. Young migrant folks generally are not interested in working like that, in that environment, working those kinds of hours, working in that kind of labor, intense, hard work labor situation. They'd much rather work somewhere else, and there are other opportunities for them. And you see that, whether it's in warehouses, whether it's in the hospitality industry, the restaurant industry, whatever it is. So labor shortages and trying to figure that out are going to continue to be an issue. As a result, mechanization becomes more and more important, trying to find ways to mechanize so that you don't have to rely on people. So mechanization is going to be a key issue going forward. If you can't solve labor, you better solve it with mechanization, otherwise you will be out of business. So we see all kinds of clever ways to approach that. Here's two on the bottom right. Or bottom and right, the over the row berry picking machines, that's been traditionally used for processed berries only. In other words, those that get made into jams, jellies, pies. But now we have new technology that we've been working on for the last 5, 6, 7 years at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center with other universities from around the country to develop an improved system to be able to harvest for fresh market, which has always had to be by hand, so the berries don't get bruised. So that's important work. And then in the bottom left, that's the world's first blueberry tree. A blueberry tree being developed at North Willamette Research and Extension Center, which could revolutionize the blueberry industry if we're successful. It's right now being patented, so it's come along quite a ways in the last 10 years. This is basically a straighter stem that will allow the catch plates in a berry picking machine, like the one on the right, to go down the row and be able to flick the berries off, drop them onto the catch plate. Right now, you lose about 30% to 35% of all the blueberries when you try to machine pick blueberries off of a plant, because it's a multiple stem plant. And here, if it's a single stem, we can solve that problem. So that's the kind of thing we're looking at. The next issues for us in agriculture, and obviously relate closely to the basin here, the issues of water supply, water use. It's no surprise to any of us here tonight to know that water is a finite resource. There's only so much of it to go around. We have more and more people demanding more and more water, whether it's for personal use, for business use, for industrial use, or for agricultural use. And so being able to utilize the water that is available and utilize it most efficiently and not waste it is becoming more and more and more important. And so you see all kinds of new technologies moving away from broadcast irrigation, like in the upper left, moving into the drip systems, which we've been using for many years, the large booms that have directed spray. They have systems in order to turbulate the water droplets so they drop straight down instead of blowing across the landscape. Pot and pot, which is a nursery system, which is being used by some nurseries. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that can be done. Sprinkler heads that are much more efficient in being able to control, regulate, laser sensors to turn supply on and off. Again, all designed to get the most crop out of every drop. That's the name of the game. And then, of course, markets. These will continue to be huge issues. Markets are often dependent on political forces outside of us on the ground with pitch in our hands or dirt in our fingernails, especially when it comes to trade tariffs, trade agreements between countries, international stuff. These become huge issues. And will continue to need to be negotiated. It took one of our faculty members down at North Willamette Research Extension Center. He's been working on trying to help the blueberry industry here in Oregon and across the country, I might say, open up the Chinese market to importing fresh blueberries. You can imagine with a country with the population size of China as well as other Asian countries, that if they would allow us to ship in fresh blueberries, it could create an incredible market for farmers here on the West Coast that could trade into that marketplace pretty efficiently. It's taken 10 years. They had it all set up. Everything was signed, sealed, and delivered. And then a couple of years ago, when President Trump put the embargo on trade with China to put pressure on them, that whole thing went on the back burner. Then again, a year and a half later, it came off the back burner when they got the trade agreement in place. And now we are today importing into, and it was opened up last year, importing, or I should say China is importing our blueberries here from the United States. So we will continue to work with markets, finding niches for our products and expanding the opportunities for agriculture going forward. For us in the basin here in particular, but North Willamette Valley regionally, the growing population, the density, the pressure that's going to put on land can't be overestimated. We know that in this area of the state right here, that we're going to probably see a doubling of the population within the next 30 years. And so that means more people to feed. Most of those people will not be farmers. In fact, there's only 1.5% of all Americans today that actually grow any food, a significant amount of food besides a backyard garden, but are the ones that are farming and feeding the other 98.5% of us alone in this country. So land use pressures, expansion of the urban growth boundary and where that's going to go next. It's inevitable that it has to expand. At some point, the current boundary has to move just to create more space to develop not only business, but home sites. So, right to farm issues, which have been a problem for some in the past, will only probably intensify as we have more and more competition for land. So what's the way forward on all of this? Well, there's a whole bunch of things. I'm just going to highlight quickly, increasing productivity and economic prosperity. That's kind of the bottom line. So cultural practices and how you improve the growing of your crops will continue to be a huge issue, and we need to get better at it, and we do every year. Improving environmental practices is going to be really important. At North Willamette, we're developing a smart sprayer, which reduces the amount of pesticide that has to be applied to the land by 70% and still get the same efficacy. That's going to be a huge game changer for agriculture, not only in this part of the country, but all over the United States and if not the world, using sensor technology, laser technology. Pesticide registration research, coming up with new tools. I mean, you can't be a farmer and not use chemicals of some kind. Even our organic growers use pesticides. They just, often they might not advertise that, but they do. They use pesticides too. They have to be organically approved pesticides. They're different chemistries, but they still go through all of the same registration process with the federal EPA. So we do that work at North Willamette. We conduct the efficacy research. We're looking at the potential for new products. We're looking at softer chemistries. We're looking at finding products that don't have residue issues, so that when people ingest food crops, there's no human health problems. New markets. We're always looking for new ways to diversify that portfolio and make agriculture as economically favorable as far as their economic environment, because if you can't keep farmers financially viable, then they won't be there to produce your crop. So our work focuses on a lot of crops, like we've been looking at flax because it's such a low input crop, doesn't require irrigation, has very few pests. Those are the kinds of things that I think are really going to be appealing as we go forward. We've got a new faculty member who's developing a quinoa industry in the state. That's what you see on the right. That's quinoa being grown at the research center. Obviously, new cultivars always being developed for things like hazelnut, blight resistant, Christmas trees. We have new varieties or new species we're looking at, berry crops. If you've ever heard of the Marion berry, that was developed by Oregon State University in our berry crop research program. We also developed the hood strawberry. Those just don't occur. Somebody actually has to develop those. We're working with cider apples now, developing that industry in Oregon, olives. We've talked about hemp, a whole variety of things. And then technology, that's going to be how we have to approach a lot of these problems. I mentioned it with lasers and sensors and having technology today that allows us to be much more sophisticated in how we manage our crops and minimize our inputs. Robotics, mechanization, we're using drones more and more. We're trying to figure out what those algorithms are so that we can interpret the data on the ground. That's all going to be a bigger and bigger and bigger part of agriculture going forward. And then finally, I might say something briefly about agrivoltaics, which is a combination of electrical, solar energy, generating it on agricultural land, and at the same time growing crops on that agricultural land. So between the array panels, underneath the array panels, and we're just setting up what will be probably the only kind of its research area in the entire world out at North Willamette that's going to explore that relationship between growing food, conserving water, generating energy so that you can close the loop and the farmer won't have to get energy from anywhere except on his farm. And then the energy that is produced in excess will become another, quote, crop for him that he can sell back into the grid to power homes across the country. We think it's revolutionary. We think it's going to be certainly something for the future. And then the final thing is obviously more and more people. Somebody has to produce the food. We're going to probably find ways to bring the food more directly to the people. Growing population, reduced land base. Indoor agriculture is kind of a buzzword right now. There are some challenges with thinking about that in terms of the carbon footprint, but this is a huge movement in Europe, and I suspect we'll see more and more of it. You're seeing more and more of it all the time, growing things hydroponically, in soilless substrate, vertical agriculture. Those are all things that we're going to see more of in a controlled environment, especially if we can solve the energy issue. Then all of a sudden things like this make even more sense. There's just a couple of websites. If any of this is of interest to you, that's our research center website, the top one. Statistics, you can get all you want from the USDA. They're the keeper of statistics. Oregon Department of Agriculture has just an incredible wealth of information on every topic related to agriculture on their website. And of course, locally, we have our Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District, which has all kinds of cool stuff for local agriculture and farming in the region. So I'll close with that and borrow a photo from Oregon Lavender Farm right here in the basin. Wonderful people, worldwide business that's been developed there over the years, besides being a beautiful place in the summertime. Really an incredible example of creativity in agriculture. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, Gail.
Well, Mike, that was marvelous. We appreciate you taking the time to do this, and we'll open it up to questions. And we've got our famous moderator or, text sifter, Susie Cloutier there. Would you mind maybe going through a few of those questions? I saw some really good questions being posted.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions here. I have to make a statement that the agrivoltaics it looks fascinating, and what an amazing thing to have that be a nexus of power and food generation, water generation. My farm is up here in Sandy, so we've had a lot of kind of discomfort from local agricultural folks that watch some of their neighbors sell out their ag fields for photovoltaic farms. So it'll be really interesting to see this.
Well, you're right, Susie, and it's a huge issue in terms of land use in this state. And we do have land use regulations about utilizing prime farmland for energy production. And so agrivoltaics is an attempt to kind of look at how we can integrate those two together and everybody can benefit.
Yeah, so it's my understanding that that in order to do a solar farm, photovoltaics, that you have to have a lower level of agricultural productivity on that piece of land. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is true now because of land use law. But I think the opportunity to combine the two together, even on higher productivity land, is going to be the opportunity. Won't be suitable for every crop. That's what the research is going to be about. Try to figure that out to do that. But imagine the day someday when there are electric tractors and farmers farming during the day, plugging in their tractor at night, running all my irrigation pumps off of the solar, off the electrical energy I produce on the farm, fertilization, creating their own fertilizer on the farm using that electrical power. You can almost start imagining what that might look like, but we got a long way.
Yeah. Oh, well, it all starts with a step. So I have several questions here. And I think that you may have answered that one from Gary from your slide on Oregon's farm gate value crops in the state. He said, what percentage of that 5.5 billion is international? But it's my understanding that that was just Oregon based.
Well, yeah, that's Oregon based in terms of that's the sale. So if I'm a farmer and I produce a crop and it goes through the gate, I sell it to somebody, and it could be sold anywhere, locally or to an export market. It has value when I sell it and it leaves the farm. So that's what that is. To answer Gary's question, I can't quote yet, but oh golly, there's obviously a significant amount of our agriculture production that does go overseas. So is an export crop. It might be 30% or something like that, or maybe more. I quote it to you.
Oh, right. Well, Gary asks, so this is a question from someone with an agricultural background, may have the answer. And Gary, this cracked me up. I moved here from Rhode Island and I get it. And he said, why is the density of the insect population in the Portland metro area so much lower than what I have anecdotally experienced in Nebraska, Rhode Island, and Virginia? Mosquitoes are virtually non-existent. Butterflies and moths are much smaller numbers. Why is this?
It's a good question. I think that's one of the things that attracted a lot of us to the Pacific. There's not a lot of bugs. Yeah, and there are a few snakes, but not many. Yeah, it depends where you're at, of course. No, you're right. We do have mosquitoes, don't get me wrong. And you don't have to go too far here in Clackamas County to find them. And there's 6, 8 different major mosquito species that we have, but it usually tend to be in the wetter areas, adjacent to river, that kind of a thing. But we certainly do have mosquitoes. He's fortunate he hasn't found any yet.
I do want to mention as well that I'm a huge insect fan on my farm, but we do, for those of you who can't stand getting nibbled on by mosquitoes, Clackamas County has a vector control, and they'll deliver an African mosquito fish called a gambusia, a little tiny fish to put in your fish ponds and your non-connected water troughs and whatnot to keep the mosquito population down naturally. So another question from Gary is the Oregon timber industry required to plant diverse tree crops, or are they permitted to plant fast-growing monoculture crops, which are more vulnerable to disease?
Well, let's see. How would I respond to that? You're required to plant trees. So let's start there. After you harvest trees, commercial harvest of trees for a forest crop, you're required within 5 years to have it established. So in our country, that means you got to plant them pretty much right away. Otherwise, other vegetation will start growing, and trying to plant afterwards will be difficult. Now, our number one tree that is planted is Douglas fir. And I can imagine, just based on the question, that some might look at that as a monoculture crop and fast growing and not good. I might step back from that and say, well, Douglas fir is native to this area. It is the most valuable tree, period, in the entire world. There's no tree in the world that is grown for more or used for more different kinds of products than Douglas fir. It is a unique, strong wood for housing construction. So it is fast growing, and we like that. But it also has some incredible properties no other tree in the world has. So that's a reason why people like to grow it. And that's why Oregon right now, if you just look at the entire United States, maybe 20% of the standing timber in the entire United States is here in Oregon. Guess why? Because we grow these vast forests of largely Douglas fir. Back to the Forest Practices Act, you're required to plant trees. You don't have to plant a particular species. And, depending on the grower and their objective and what they're trying to do, and if they want to have an intermediate harvest, they might plant a variety of species, 2 or 3 different on the ground. But there's no requirement that they have to plant a particular kind of tree.
All right. We have a question. Does Oregon have a seed vault to preserve seeds for future generations?
There are some programs like that. I don't know of one that's done by the state of Oregon, but there are a number of organizations that have their own seed saving and seed vault programs going on. Typically, these are, some of the nonprofit groups and those that are particularly focused on seed conservation.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I love the diversity of questions here for you, Mike. We're really going to put you through your paces.
Carol, I don't guarantee I'll have an answer for every one of them.
Carol asks, how long do blueberry plants live?
Good question. And blueberry plant, one of the cool things about blueberries is they are a long-lived plant. If we just look for a minute at berry crops in general, strawberries can live for a number of years, but typically the way they're farmed, after about 3, 4, 5 years in the ground, we have enough endemic in the soil naturally diseases that it starts to really decline the productivity of the berries. And so a lot of the growers will shift from this field to another field and maybe fallow a field in between in order to be able to continue to produce at a high level. Pardon me. With blueberries, and so they're treated almost as a 2, 3, 4 year crop. Same thing can be said with raspberries and blackberries. They get hit by soil disease. Blueberries do not. And so blueberries can grow easily for 30 years or even longer and still produce at a high level. And so it's much more of a kind of, let's call it a more productive perennial crop which makes it very valuable to the farmer, because once they've established it and gone through all the cost and work and maintenance to get it established, then it will produce for many years.
Great. This may be a rhetorical question, but Peter asks, are there any other universities that work as hard as OSU in the ag sector?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. We would like to say we're the top ag school, of course, in the country, but we're not. We aspire to be the top 10 in the United States. And I think the last statistics I saw were pretty close to that. But yeah, there's some great ag schools throughout the country. And I mentioned my alma mater, at least for my bachelor's degree, was Iowa State. That's a great ag school. Davis, UC Davis, California, always ranked very high, if not the top ag school in the country. I mean, we could go down the list. Yes, there's many wonderful institutions, not only here in America, but around the world, because why? We all have to eat. And again, most of us aren't producing the food we need. And so there is some incredible technology and there's some incredible collaboration between these institutions as everybody is trying to solve the same problems.
Right, and I might note that regionally, different schools are top in their agricultural sector. I went to the University of Rhode Island and it was top in turf grass. So
yeah, okay.
We started in dairy, we ended up in turf grass. We have a question, do evergreen trees create natural herbicides that are toxic to mosquitoes?
Ooh, I should know that, but I'm gonna plead ignorance on that. There's a whole host of phenols and different chemicals that are produced in conifer foliage. In fact, that's what you smell when you're walking out in the woods. You smell that conifer forest scent. Now, as far as repellent, there are some that have been used, I know, or thought to be have repellent value for insects like mosquitoes. I can't quote you anything right offhand. So I'm going to have to pass on that. Yeah, I can't.
All right. I'm going to do two more questions. We have one on the board and I'm going to ask the batting home question, I think. So what is the potential for agricultural export market here? If it's about 30% of a $5.5 billion state ag market, how much bigger can this market become?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm going to say that, if I had that crystal ball, I'd probably be somewhere else tonight. But in all truth, it can obviously grow. And the example I cited earlier about the Chinese market for fresh blueberries is an example of that. That's just opened last year in 2020 for the first time. And again, you can almost imagine with 1 billion people how the demand could really create a unique market opportunity for growers in America. Now, what's cool about Oregon agriculture is that we are here on the Pacific Rim. The Pacific Rim is our primary trading partner. And, those of us in the West or on the West Coast are in the prime location to be able to move product. Not that it's close by, but it's closer than certainly if you're in Rhode Island, right? We have the potential and have been very active. Our Oregon Department of Agriculture has been very active for many years, working all throughout the Asian continent and developing new markets, Japan, Korea, Vietnam. You can go right down the list. So I think if I'm looking at the potential, it's going to continue to be not just big, but going to grow. And I think the thing that is unfortunate, however, the reality, I should say, is that it is driven by politics, and there's no way you're going to probably get out of that. When I was working with Christmas trees for many, many years, we tried to really penetrate the Japanese market and convince our friends in Japan that they needed to celebrate Christmas. And of course, if you know anyone from Japan, you know that they really do love a lot of things that come from America. They absolutely love blue jeans, for instance. And they really love a lot of things that come from Oregon. There's this unique connection. If you look at their climate, their geography, they're very similar in many ways to here in the Northwest. And we tried really hard to work into that market. And what it often boiled down to was, well, yeah, we will take X number of Christmas trees, but you guys got to take more Toyotas. So, it becomes something that the farmer, the agricultural community can't deal with that. Those are policy level decisions made between governments and presidents or prime ministers or trade negotiators or whatever that is. And so our ag community works closely with the Oregon Department of Agriculture. The Oregon Department of Agriculture organizes trade missions, brings growers, producers back there, tries to cultivate that interest. But at the end of the day, it's a long, slow process. But the potential is huge.
So the reciprocity exists everywhere, even in the ag sector. We buy more Toyotas. Okay.
Yeah.
I will hit you with one last question, and then I'm working on, as you well know, a pesticide strategic plan for the Clackamas River Basin. So I'm look at agriculture with a very narrow lens sometimes of pesticide use. And one thing that's really amazing is this smart sprayer technology, and it really is so cutting edge. And I look at technologies like that, and the fact that they can reduce the use of pesticides by 70% by having these, directed spray streams. Is there? I know it's also very, financially, it's kind of out of the realm of your workaday farmer. Are there financial programs that are going to be in place for helping folks with technologies that can help agriculture improve and lower the pollution rates kind of thing?
That's a good question. I'm not right off. I can say I'm not familiar with, say, a cost share program that would kind of address that. I will say, though, that the technology is evolving. That the graphics I showed you, that was not the earliest prototype by any means, but it was one of the earlier ones. And that was actually, those photos were taken up at Hans Nelson Nursery up out of Bondi. And the Nelsons have been huge cooperators on that project. In fact, Dan, who's the current patriarch, Dad's passed on, really was instrumental in bringing a lot of the grant funding from the federal government that supported that, because he went to them and worked with our congressional delegation and said, this technology will totally revolutionize just not my industry, but potentially all of agriculture if we can figure it out. So what's happened, though, is that now that it's been commercialized, so what you saw there was kind of the government scientists whipping this concept together and field testing and figuring out how to make it work. Now that commercialization of that has resulted in a retrofit system that can be attached literally to any farmer's existing spray system. And that's American ingenuity, in my opinion, that they won't have to necessarily have that $50,000, $75,000 piece of equipment. They can take their existing technology and with the proper modifications, plug and go. That's where we're going with it.
That's a very exciting prospect. Mike, thanks for answering all of these great questions, and thanks everybody for your great questions. I'll hand it back.
Thanks, Susie. So just a couple announcements before we adjourn for this evening. Again, thanks, Mike. I just wanted to mention to everybody that our next session will be on June 1st, and it'll be our first session on climate. It'll be with our local experts from the Portland area who have developed a number of plans for various counties around Oregon about climate, how they are going to try to adapt to them. So this will be the first of a number of programs we'll have on climate with regards to forests and fish and all those kinds of things. So if you're interested in climate, regardless of where you are in Oregon, I strongly urge you to attend this one that's coming up. And you can use the same Zoom link that you've sent, gone or used for these past sessions. And then we'll also send you a thank you email with these links, as well as a link to the recording for more information about getting continuing education from Clackamas Community College. And so again, thanks again to Mike for tonight's wonderful talk. Extremely informative, as I would have expected. And we also thank our gold sponsor, Clackamas Water Environment Services, and our bronze sponsors, the Clackamas River Water Providers and the Geological Society of the Oregon Country, for helping us bring this conference free for all participants. So again, if you can consider supporting us with a little donation, that'd be great. Even $5 will help. So thank you for joining us tonight, and please let us know what you thought of tonight's program, and we'll see you 2 Tuesdays from now on June 1st. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
You bet.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks all. Excellent.
Glenn, hello, Glenn. I saw your name on the.
Hello. Amazing. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Mike.
Hey, it was fun. I enjoyed it very much. So if anybody needs anything, feel free to contact me or contact Glenn. He knows where I'm at. We'll help however we can. And hello, Rob Guttridge. Good to see you. Just saw your name. I figured I'd see a few folks on the screen that I know.
Some loyal Estacadans, I want you to know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, some of the Estacada spring water connection.
Right.
Okay, take care, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
evening.
Mike.
You bet.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you, Susie, for your help tonight.
All right. Good night, everybody.